So for this final panel, the topic builds on some things that we've mentioned in the previous two, and that is the challenges of investigating and researching oligarchs. Oligarchs as a particular category, and some of the questions I've been asking the panelists is there such a thing as an oligarch? What are the problems in using the term? What are some of the particular difficulties in pushing back against the layers of protection that oligarchs have? And what investigative research techniques or tools do each of these professionals who are involved in researching, investigating oligarchs, what do they have to suggest as effective strategies? But before we go to the panel here, I want to go to our very distinguished speaker who is coming in from Kiev today, who unfortunately isn't able to join us. I think you're in the middle of a presidential campaign or something minor there. But Daria Kaleniuk, we are so incredibly grateful to have you. I know it's late there, and I know you have a lot of different obligations. Daria is the executive director and co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine, and she is, as you'll know from her bio, experienced in all forms of anti-corruption, and she has been doing the rounds when here in the U.S. talking about the importance of the networks of power and representation that Ukrainian oligarchs have with so-called Western enablers. So I think before we go to the panel, I wanted to give the floor to Daria that she can share with us some of her experiences on both the Ukrainian side and the Western side of what is the challenge of dealing with oligarchs, who are these layers of enablers, and then perhaps to also share with us some of the pushback tactics she and her organization have experienced as a result of their sort of, pesky anti-corruption campaigns. So I think all that will really enrich our conversation. So Daria, thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Sorry that I'm not able to be there with you offline, but I hope that you can hear me all well. I'm glad that I can see you all. Alex is right. We are in the middle of the presidential elections in Ukraine, and the issue of oligarchs has very practical matter for me and for my organization and for my country. And the issue is that it's not the citizens of Ukraine who actually decide who will be the next president, but it's more the oligarchs who control the TV channels, who actually impact the political and election campaigns of presidential candidates. So on Sunday, we had our first round of presidential elections. And the results are remarkable. Volodymyr Zelensky, who is the unexperienced politician, he is a comedian. He's known for running a very popular comedian talk show and a series of comedian movies like Servant of the People at the national TV. So this guy got 30% of support of voters in comparing to the current president of Ukraine, President Poroshenko, who got 15%. And there are many reasons why he was so successful, but one of the key reasons is just because he received support of 1+1 TV channel, which is the one controlled and owned by one of the most powerful oligarchs in Ukraine, Mr. Kolomoisky. Unfortunately, this is what is happening in Ukraine from year to year. The one who controls TV at the end controls the elections. And 75% of Ukrainian TV market is being owned by 4 major oligarchs. It's apart from mentioned Mr. Kolomoisky, there is Mr. Akhmetov, there is Mr. Firtash, who is actually on the home arrest in Vienna on the request of the Department of Justice in the United States. And he has not been extradited to the United States for already 3 years. But he's still, being at the house arrest in Vienna, he is able to impact Ukrainian politicum and Ukrainian politics through his network of reliable people in Ukraine and through his TV channel, which is Inter TV channel. And the last one is Mr. Pinchuk. But President Poroshenko himself also is known to be an oligarch, and he has at least 2 TV channels. So in Ukraine, there is this specifics of competition between oligarchs, and all oligarchs who respect themselves, they actually have their own TV. Most of them also have their own bank. It's usually used as a money laundering machine, and it was very vivid on the example of Mr. Kolomoisky. And one of the most famous money laundering schemes in Ukraine was done through the Privat Bank. It was done after the Revolution of Dignity, and Privat Bank was one of, and still is one of the 3 the most big banks in Ukraine. It was too big to fail. It could not go bankrupt. The state could not let it go bankrupt. But the oligarch simply was issuing loans worth of tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to companies merely registered offshore, which he actually controlled at the end. And these companies never meant to return the loans. So the state was pouring funds into this bank, refinance funds, in order to maintain the bank and prevent it from going bankrupt. But this money were laundered outside of Ukraine through the chain of shell companies. And here we come to the role of Western enablers, so Western companies, lawyers, accountants, nominal directors, and lobbyists, which actually help to present these oligarchs as a very decent man. There is not a single woman among Ukrainian oligarchs, but these professional service providers, they present them as people who are thinking about the future of their people, of their country. They are using frequently the jurisdiction of the United States to whitewash their reputation. They provide charity donations to various funds, institutions, think tanks. And we witnessed a lot of cases like that. Whether it is hard to investigate oligarchs, honestly, it is hard because Ukrainian oligarchs, and I believe oligarchs in many other countries, they have already legalized their illicit gains. So they are either in the second or in the third stage of layering. For example, Rinat Akhmetov, Ukrainian, the most wealthy person, he is not even hiding that he owns hundreds and thousands of businesses in Ukraine. But he also relies on the Western financial system. His company is listed in London on the exchange, and he cares a lot about his reputation. So it is very hard to prove any wrongdoing of oligarchs, especially if you are trying to do it just from a single jurisdiction. You have to cooperate with folks, with organizations, with law enforcement agencies from other countries and other jurisdictions in order to trace the money and to prove the illicit origin of the funds of oligarchs. if you would ask me about the specific investigative tools which we found useful in Ukraine, investigating oligarchs, I would want to tell you actually the role of TV channels again. Because in Ukraine, we have a law, which I would recommend any kleptocratic country to have, which obliges all media to reveal the structure, the ownership structure, until up to the beneficial owner of the media company. And most TV channels in Ukraine actually did that. For us, all these ownership charts are very useful because all nominal directors, shell companies, which are used in the media ownership structure, are frequently also used in other asset structure, which were not known before. So we are frequently using this technique in order to identify unknown assets of Ukrainian oligarchs. If you're talking about some negative implications of oligarchs, why it is so devastating that oligarchs impact elections? Because it turns the country into the vicious circle of corruption. If oligarchs control elections, they control who will be the members of the parliament, and they control at the end who will be the prime minister, who will be the certain minister, who will sit in the boards of the state-owned companies. They actually own MPs, and this helps them to create various schemes for siphoning off money from the state, which are actually legal. So they are advocating through the MPs they own some small changes in the legislation or in the subordinate legislation, in regulations, which create monopolies for them. They also try to control, and very often they are, prosecutors, judiciary, and in order to prevent any investigations against them. After the Revolution of Dignity, we had a chance to change that. And we managed to set up the new Anti-Corruption Investigative Agency, which is the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which is triggering cases against managers of oligarchs, I would say like that. So against senior officials who are abusing the state functions for the benefit of their pocket and for the benefit of the pocket of oligarchs. So it is very hard to start any investigation against oligarchs themselves, as they are not doing corruption and money laundering with their own hands and their own identity. They are using their network, nominees, and of trusted persons. And very often this network consists of state officials with senior positions. And NABU actually started investigations against untouchable people in Ukraine, against the head of the state fiscal service, against the members of the parliament, against the ministers, judges, prosecutors. And in return for this work, NABU is the agency which is under constant attacks of various political forces in Ukraine, very frequently backed up by oligarchs. And we are also under constant attacks because we are the organization which exposes corruption and which demands reaction of law enforcement and controlling agencies to this corruption. We are also the organization which protects new anti-corruption institutions. So, and the most recent attack at us, actually, it's very fresh, happened last week. There is a very strange journalist from The Hill media, which is Washington-based media. The journalist's name is John Solomon. He prepared a set of columns, which are op-eds, his op-eds, suggesting a lot of strange and verified things and fake news. These columns were based on the interview which Ukraine Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko gave to this journalist. And one of the columns is about Anti-Corruption Action Center, about our organization, which he calls Soros Group, which allegedly colludes with George Soros, Barack Obama, FBI, US Embassy, and I don't know, probably unknown flying objects in order to intervene into the presidential elections of the United States in 2016. And he claims that we were part of the embezzlement of $4 million financial assistance from the United States, and a few other accusations against our tiny organizations, which are probably based on the interview of very corrupt Prosecutor General of Ukraine, who's actually covering up oligarchs and covering up corruption. So the guy simply attacked us through the access to the United States media and journalists. So I have an open question. Why did this journalist did like that? Is he actually a journalist, or he is backed up with some other interests and lobbyists? So last week, and actually this week, I was busy with preparing all sort of rebuttals to these accusations against us. So in our case showed that for oligarchs and for kleptocrats in the country like Ukraine, these people, they are trying to attack civil society, if not physically, then internationally through the use of Western enablers and lawyers. It's not the first instance when the US media was used to blackmail us. So there was a column of former US ambassador to Bahrain at the Fox News 2 years ago saying that I have enormous wealth in Ukraine and I got this wealth from the American taxpayers. So it is very interesting what is happening in Ukraine, but to finish my speech, I would like to say that grand corruption, kleptocracy, oligarchic regimes, they, in developing countries, they rely heavily on the access to Western financial system, to Western lawyers, to Western lobbyists, and to Western whitewashing machine. And these people, they have enormous money, enormous influence. They easily can resolve any criminal case against them in the country of their origin, like in Ukraine. They can fight easily with civil society and other opponents. But if the fight goes internationally, if we work against oligarchs and kleptocrats with partners from civil society organizations in other countries, if we coordinate our work with foreign investigative journalists, if Ukrainian investigative agencies, the new reformed investigative agencies, work closely with foreign investigative agencies in order to trace complex money laundering and corruption, then we can win this fight. Otherwise, if we simply rely to a developing country saying, okay, guys, you are corrupt like hell, you have to change something, it's not fair. Because on the example of Ukraine, after the Revolution of Dignity, 1 million of citizens of Ukraine went to protest against corruption and for European values and for European integration and for dignity. However, new political elite and new political alternative was not able to unite and to emerge. One of the reasons is because this political alternative did not have that much access to media resources and to actually wealth resources as current politicians have.
Right. Thank you, Daria. I don't mean to cut you off, but we're short on time. We have to get to the panel.
Yeah.
That was such a perfect way to set up the problematique, so to speak, that I think we need to forge real tangible partnerships and coalitions over both sides. So I know you've had a very long day and that you've been on the BBC and sharing your expertise with various with various constituents. So I want to thank you for kicking things off. And do you want to mention the website of your organization in case anyone in the audience is interested in finding out more about you and the work that you do?
Absolutely. It's antac.org.ua. We publish a lot in English. We are also Antac.ua in Twitter, where we publish in English. And I'm available in Facebook. You can reach me easily there.
Perfect. Daria, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's go to the rest of the panel. I just want to mention also one other absence of the panel, and that is Professor Janina Sagnini, who was due to appear here, who's Knight Professor of Data Journalism at the School of Journalism, unfortunately had to drop out. I mention her because she is at the cutting edge of bringing data science to investigative stories about oligarchs. And if anyone read the Adam Davidson piece in the New Yorker about certain activities overseas in Kazakhstan and Georgetown and sort of the Albiasov network, that was in part the result of a lot of investigative work one of her courses had done into this business. So I would really recommend that we connect with her, and hopefully we'll include her in a future session. I want to move on to the rest of the panel today. The idea was, I'm not going to read their bios in the interest of time, but the idea was to bring three different professionals who are working on this investigation of oligarchs, in addition to sort of the NGO explicitly anti-corruption perspective we just heard from Daria, to talk about how they go about dealing with oligarchs and this layer, this buffering that Daria talked about. So first will be Ren McEachern, who is managing director of Exeger's Silver Spring office, and where he focuses on anti-bribery investigation. And Ren has experience in the FBI, where he was the special agent of the Washington Field Office International Corruption Squad. So, Ren, looking forward to your thoughts on this challenge, as Daria put it. How do we investigate oligarchs?
So thanks, Alex, and the Institute, and the School of Journalism and the School of Law as well here at Columbia. These forums are really critical, and I think what you guys are doing and bringing together unusual groups, quite frankly, to look at the problem holistically is incredibly important. As you mentioned, before I joined Exeter, I was in the FBI and actually spent a lot of time looking really at kleptocrats. And there's a lot of definitions, I understand that, and there's lots of definitions of oligarchs, and we can go around the room about labels and things like that, but there was really grand corruption. And to Tom Firestone's comments earlier, one of the things that we were doing in 2014 and 2015 is actually re-examining the way we looked at international corruption at the FBI. And of course, my comments today don't represent those of the government or the FBI. I'm former. And one of the areas we looked at was the economic model of grand corruption, and that's the supply and demand model. And so, as most of you know, the FCPA has been around for 40 years now and is very good at targeting the supply side, the companies, and those domestic folks and domestic entities that may fall into that definition. And there's a lot of great, wonderful success there. But the other issue is, where do these bribe payments go and who's demanding the bribes? And at the government level, it was really quite interesting. We could actually see where these bribe payments were going ultimately. And they go to horrific places. And it goes back to several people mentioned today about human rights and human suffering. I'll spare you the details, but it's it's terrible. And we also saw a lot of connectivity between corruption and things like national security. One of the models that we looked at was actually the Arab Spring, and what happened in Tunisia was the result of ultimately corruption, right? The fruit peddler needed to pay a bribe to get a license, and he refused. And he kept getting basically harassed by the police, and he said, it's enough, and he goes and lights himself on fire, and the Arab Spring begins. And that really changed things for the U.S. government, because suddenly there was a lot of instability in places like Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, right? And across over to Syria. And as the U.S. government looked at that, they said, well, there has to be a better approach to this. And one of the areas we were looking at is bringing law and order and rule and order to areas that were highly unstable because of basically massive corruption. And we weren't suggesting that the FCPA could solve the ISIS problem that came out of this. But we could certainly say, if we can keep governments in place and keep them stable, that's a much better long-term goal than having to put troops back on the ground, right? That's a very horrific kind of extreme reaction to some of that. But that's ultimately what happened. That's happening right now in Syria, right? We're still seeing that. And so that was the initial approach. So we said, okay, how do we look at the demand side? And we worked closely with lots of entities within the U.S. government and realized that we weren't going to be able to change or amend the FCPA as discussed today. Although I applaud those efforts, it's a real challenge, and what Gary's doing is truly courageous and important. But that's going to be a Herculean effort. It's going to be very difficult. But we decided that we could also look at seizure and forfeiture actions when assets are tied to the U.S. and the U.S. banking system. And so when we're putting together the new teams on international corruption, they weren't FCPA teams, they weren't kleptocracy teams, they were international corruption teams, because we wanted to focus on both. And we had the backing of important units within the Department of Justice and the SEC, like the money laundering asset recovery section. So MLARS was a very big part of that discussion, and they continue to be a very big part of that program. And so that's where my backing is, and I actually led teams and chased kleptocrats around the globe and went after their assets. At the end of the day, this is about really one thing, and it's about money. And for anybody that plays in this space or looks at this space or researches this space, it's about the money and following the money. And that is what we did at the Bureau. That's what I do now for Exeter. We conduct a lot of investigations, and we really starts at the money trail. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that more efficiently on the private sector side using technology. But the discussion has to focus around money. Companies have to get money out in order to pay bribes. And then the receivers, the oligarchs, kleptocrats, whoever that might be, they have to find a way to accept that money, and they have to park it somewhere. A lot of people alluded to the GTOs today about property. This is the best place to invest your money, and US dollars is the safest place to put your money. It's the most secure and stable currencies. That's not going to change for a while. And so really the US needs to take a smart and leadership position, and they have for a long time. But I think what the OECD is doing, and they're doing great work, and I've worked with them over the years when I was in the government, is they're finally bringing legislation and consistent legislation around the globe to say that, look, we can do this, we can police our own, we can use our own domestic laws. We were talking earlier about how many domestic enforcement actions have come out of FCPA cases. I don't have the number, but I can tell you that the sharing of information between governments now is better than ever before. And quite frankly, the US government would rather prefer that people police their own than have the US come in with a big stick of the FCPA or forfeiture and seizure warrants out of civil actions. We really, when I was there, we're really pushing for police their own, because countries that police their own are much better at doing that. They have much better buy-in. And we've been seeing this occur very nicely over the last few years, and it's really been a hockey stick as we all know here, of success. And I think Tom Firestone mentioned it earlier. You're now seeing massive global resolutions where the U.S. government is working with lots of other governments around the world, not just Brazil, not just the UK, but other parts of the world, to share information, share intelligence, and most importantly, share evidence for cases that go both directions. If we do not attack the demand side of this problem, then there's no point in having a discussion, there's no point of being in the room. That's the driver of this. We mentioned culture earlier. It will take generations to change culture in some of these countries in low integrity locations, we know that. But we can certainly change culture within companies and within legislation that we've been talking about today in getting people to do the right thing. I'm not against lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers have to be a part of the solution, are often disregarded in this space, but they're really critical to all of this. I know they get placed in all these nice little terrible buckets in the Panama Papers and things like that, but rule of order, law, and all these things, these are the critical areas we must focus on. I'm going to talk about technology a little, I think, later on in the panel about how we're doing that, because what's ultimately being created here is, thankfully, a lot more information is putting where? Out open source, okay? And so more than ever, the information's actually out there. It's connecting the dots. It's getting more tricky, and I'll talk more about that.
Right, well, why don't you do that now?
Okay.
Actually take us through
How about I do that now?
your toolkit. That would be great. Yeah.
So
I think we're on a roll.
one of the wonderful things we started to see is that with the local legislation getting passed, finally investigative journalists are really getting real, what I would say, traction. Yeah. And at times when I was with the government, we would get on the ground and people would come to us and say, we could only come to you because at the time we didn't trust the local government.
Right.
If you can imagine that, that was true. Now, thankfully, at great harm to them, investigative journalists are truly taking the forefront. This is where the rubber meets the road. These women and men are conducting investigations in low integrity places with no protection, and some of them are being killed. I think there's some very high profile cases recently. I don't need to go through them all. You all know who they are. It is critical, but more importantly, they're getting the information where? Out into the open so all of us can grab it. That's a great thing, but it's also a problematic thing, because what's happening is we're now seeing that the dots, there's so much information there. There's so much gray information. How do we pull the needles out and put them together and to say, okay, we want to look at this one problem and these few people, but I'm getting pulled in all these directions, all the information. One of the fun things I get to do now at Exeger is I still get to conduct investigations, which is something, of course, at the heart of what I do, but I get to use artificial intelligence. And it's really natural language processing is really the key to this, NLP, which is able to go out and pull from structured, unstructured data sets, depending on the different mediums, and pull down data sets that are relevant to what I'm looking at. Okay, this is not just Exeter. There's lots of companies that do that. This is not a sales pitch. There's lots of good technologies out there that can help you be better researchers and investigators and drive to those data points, which are so critical. The technology is great. It pulls things out and can say, okay, Wren was arrested for corruption. Wren made an arrest for corruption. And when you're pulling data down, that's a very different thing, right? And so we want to look at the data that's most important. So when you're looking at big data sets, or you're doing those searches, be smart, be mindful. There's actually tools out there to help you be smarter, better, faster. The reality is the data sets are so big at the government level, internal investigations for corporations, for other governments around the world. When you do a search warrant, for example, and you're pulling down terabytes of information, finding those needles in the haystack is such a challenge. And it's a challenge on the private sector side too. It's a challenge for banks that are doing good KYC efforts, okay? And so what I'm asking is, and what I'm asking you to think about is when you are taking on those challenges, do it smarter. There's no way you can do it by yourself, and it's not humanly possible to start connecting the dots. And so I spend a lot of my time working with clients and saying, okay, what are the questions that we're asking? How big is the data sets? How do we use data analytics, AI, natural language processing, and bring those together to bring out those key data points and bring them together. Using AI now investigations has totally changed the way I do my work. It's incredibly robust, and it's not replacing me, it's an extension of me and my team. And so often we'll look at a problem, we'll bring a very good forensic accountant, maybe we'll bring a top paralegal, we'll bring a lawyer, and a top investigator together, we can say, okay, we can actually model the way we search through this by what we look at relevant and not relevant in data formats. And so that's the way you're gonna have to be looking at these issues going forward. This will be, for everybody, a big data problem, and for most of you who are already struggling with this. Don't let big data prevent you from doing your job, whether it's due diligence or finding out who did what or where the money went. We do a lot of this with the asset tracing, which is a huge part of this. It goes back to chasing the money and chasing the assets. And so that's what I've been doing with XJUR. It's been a lot of fun, but I know we have other people who have some really interesting backgrounds, and so I'll share that with you guys. But thank you.
Okay, great. So I want to move now on to Casey Michel. So Casey Michel jumped on the panel just a few days ago. Thank you, Casey.
Absolutely.
But also, just in terms, I don't think this is corruption. I think this is just us being proud. I want to mention that Casey has an MA from the Harriman Institute, and we're really proud of what he's done. He's an investigative reporter with Think Progress. He's written pieces all over foreign affairs, foreign policy. You'll see them there. But I do want to mention something. Casey began working on these FARA issues right here as an MA student. He was talking about how money flowing to think tanks, especially, was shaping, if not compromising, the coverage that governments from the former Soviet Union got in various sort of forums. So I'm glad to see that you're continuing this investigative work outside. And what I asked Casey is to tell us a little bit about life of an investigative reporter in this day and age when they try and explore some of the connections that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, obviously thanks to Alex and to Harriman for helping craft me into the person that I am today. It was certainly a timely topic to cover when I was here, and it's proven only timelier since. One of the journalists that Daria actually mentioned, a gentleman named John Solomon, was somebody I had the pleasure of writing about for my master's thesis for his work with the Azeri regime in American media. So it's nice that he's staying busy. So I am an investigative journalist. I'm going to be talking about just a couple tools that I have found very useful over the past year, 2 years, in terms of tracking, in this case, post-Soviet oligarchs. I'm not an academic any longer. I'm not in government. I am certainly a significant advocate for the passage of beneficial ownership legislation, so I'd like to thank Gary and everyone at the FACT Coalition again for getting it there. But I'd rather focus on today, at least in this talk right now, how these oligarchs that I have been tracking, in this case out of Russia, how they have created, molded certain networks for, on the one hand, image management efforts on their own, but also to affect the types of preferred policies that they would like to see. In this case, again, out of Russia, that would be the lifting of certain sanctions that the U.S. has placed on certain Russian oligarchs. The two that I'm going to be mentioning throughout today are a gentleman named Vladimir Yakunin and Konstantin Malafaia. You may have heard of them. Yakunin is one of Putin's oldest confidants. He rose with him. They helped form the Ozera Dacha Cooperative, which was the kind of initial node and network that rose to power alongside Putin. He made billions running Russian railways, and he is the only oligarch that I'm aware of who created a mansion with a room devoted solely to his wife's fur coats. So that's tough to compete with as a newlywed. Konstantin Malafaia is a little bit more recent to the game. He's a little bit younger. He created this investment firm called Marshall Capital. As far as I'm aware, he does not have a room devoted solely to fur coats, but who knows? These are the two oligarchs that I've been following because I believe they present excellent case studies in recruiting and building and crafting networks of individuals, organizations in the West that have proven themselves sympathetic to certain Russian aims that work to, in this case, as they say, repair relations between the U.S. and Russia. Often they are of the, in this case, the Christian fundamentalist variant. Religious right organizations, leaders like Franklin Graham, who have no compunction about working with individuals like Yakunin and Malafaia. So in tracking these networks over the past few years, there's three tools from a journalistic perspective I have found incredibly useful. One of them, Ren just mentioned, that's open source. Not necessarily AI or machine learning tools, but open source insofar as social media posts, Facebook and Instagram photos. Is everyone familiar with Bellingcat? Anyone, maybe? So this is an investigative outfit that really rose to prominence over the past few years, relying almost entirely on open source. They've been able to debunk any number of conspiracy theories about things like the downing of MH17 in Ukraine by, again, social media posts and Google Earth photos, actually, just matching up where people were, when they were there, what equipment did they have, and did that match up with their own, with what the officials were saying. One instance I found that useful, I'll have a couple examples sprinkled through here, but one example I found that useful is Malafaia's right-hand man is a gentleman named Alexei Komov. Komov isn't sanctioned. Malafaia and Yukun are both sanctioned, but a couple years ago, Komov's main American contact unfortunately passed away. But before he didn't bother to take down his Twitter account before he passed away. And just so happens on his Twitter account, still up, and a couple months ago I decided to look through it. And lo and behold, there's a picture of Komov, who again is Malafaia's right-hand man, hanging out in Washington with Ben Carson at a nice swanky gala. Ben Carson, who's currently a member of Trump's cabinet, the HUD secretary. Or to take Vladimir Yakunin, he runs a think tank, or what he calls a think tank, out of Berlin called the Dialogue of Civilizations that advocates for the lifting of sanctions and the repairing of relations. If you poke around a little bit on the website, you come across the board of directors. Yakunin, again, has been sanctioned for 5 years, managed to recruit a number of Americans to the board of directors. So I pick up a phone and I decide to call them and I say, why are you working so closely? Do you care about working so closely with a gentleman, an oligarch in this case, who's been sanctioned by the US? Some didn't care, some thought he was perfectly fine, some knew he had a background in government, some had no idea he was sanctioned, and I was the one to break the news to them. Some didn't take it so well. Those are just two examples of open source, immediately available information that, I mean, you don't need an FBI source, you don't need someone in the current administration to find. That's one tool. The second tool is something called the Internet Archive, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a system that catalogs and screenshots millions of websites, posts, tweets, writings, articles, etc., that sometimes are then taken down. As long as you have the original URL, or even in some cases, if you don't, you can go and plug that URL into the Internet Archive, and it will show you a screenshot from a certain date. It's been very helpful. This Komov gentleman, I was able to find that a couple years ago, he was in LA at a red carpet event for a religious right filmmaking. It's called the Christian Oscars, and he was hanging out with the Duck Dynasty guys, who you may have heard of as well. The third one is a little bit more contentious. This is just the final. The Duck of Louisiana, maybe, but not nationwide. Open source, Internet Archive. The third one is a little bit more ethically contentious, and that's accessing hacked materials, something that has been in the news in the past couple of years. A couple months ago, there were a number of researchers that compiled a database of internal hacks from those close to the Kremlin, about a dozen or so different hacks from an organization called Shaltai Boltai, which is a Russian hacking outfit. These were internal communiques, these were emails, back and forth memos between, in this case, Malafaia and his network. Just so happened to include a guest list to a swanky party in Moscow a couple years ago that had a number of Americans. As far as I'm aware, and we are speaking at the J School today, there is no kind of, as of yet, ethical standards pertaining to accessing and publishing hacked materials. It's been a case-by-case scenario thus far, depending on who it is, depending on who's doing the hacking, depending on why they're hacking it. But again, that's another source that has proven wonderfully effective in terms of accessing, identifying, and tracking the networks involved with these two particular oligarchs. As it pertains to trends that I've kind of seen over the last year or two, there's two main ones that stuck out to me. The one is that this is a network creation, on the one hand, especially for Yakunin, in terms of image management. So Yakunin has this think tank, he has all his PR men, especially in the UK. There's another former Harriman grad named Max de Haldevang, who's another journalist, wrote an excellent article on how Yakunin is the poster child of reputation laundering. I would highly recommend.
He can't join us because I think he's in South Dakota tracing down shell companies.
Yeah. As you do these days. These are networks that have created certainly for image management purposes, but also for affecting the types of policy of preferred policies that they would like to see. And again, in the American context, that would be the lifting of sanctions. I think the case study in that is not necessarily Yakunin or Malafaia, but is the relationship that developed between Maria Butina and the NRA over the past couple years. Butina may or may not be a guns rights activist. The verdict is still kind of up in the air, but her primary contact was a gentleman named Alexander Cooley, who was sanctioned by the U.S., very clearly using her to build relations with like-minded or similarly goal-oriented organizations in the U.S., all of which is to say that the types of stories that I've been working on, or the journalists have been working on, seem to highlight a trend that these oligarchs in particular are not simply relying on those on K Street anymore. They're not simply relying on the types of professional PR firms, comm shops, those that would have to register with FARA. And unfortunately, this is taking place as we see strengthening Foreign Agents Registration Act guidelines, potential bills, and new efforts. So this is a sort of a secondary, or a second track almost, form of soft lobbying that we've seen develop with like-minded organizations and groups in the U.S. And the second one, and this is, again, from a journalistic perspective, is that they are not happy when you write about these networks. These people do not like to have these ties highlighted. These people do not like to have their names associated with others. I have lost track of how many emails and legal threats I've gotten over the past few months from...
Take a shot. Let us know. On a
Sure.
typical week, going through your email, or like, what percentage of your time, or how do you engage with this, and what do you think its purpose is?
The purpose of this is to stifle, absolutely, it is to stifle interest in and to deter future coverage of these links, these nodes, similar nodes, these networks, similar networks. I am very fortunate in that I have a very strong legal team behind me. All these stories that I write are vetted by our legal team. They sign off on them. When we get these responses in from lawyers representing these oligarchs or their American contacts, I forward it just immediately along to the legal team. It sometimes takes a day or two to respond. So we're talking and they have their own job to do. They don't want to deal with this. So on their end, it is a day or two at least that they have to respond. Sometimes we get further responses thereafter. The most recent one that I got was not simply a threat of litigation, but was a demand to remove the article, a demand for a public apology, and a demand for financial compensation to the victim. Now, this was from a lawyer who was also representing Cliven Bundy, who, does anyone know him? He was the militiaman out in Oregon a couple years ago. So this guy is particularly litigious. But as it pertains to time, energy, anxiety, it absolutely plays a role. And I'm saying that as someone who has a very strong legal team behind me. I can't imagine what it must be like for freelance writers, who I know, some of whom are covering this world, what kind of effect it's had on them. That would be an interesting conversation moving forward. So those are the tools and trends.
Casey, thanks so much. So now we go on to Tom Mayne, who's now a freelance researcher writer from London, but for 12 years he worked as a senior campaigner for Global Witness, an anti-corruption NGO. And Tom has researched many fantastic reports. A lot of them, I think, were just really key to sort of pulling the threads on a lot of these overlapping transnational links. I'll just mention a couple of them. Grave Secrecy, which tells the story of Asia Universal Bank in Kyrgyzstan, which turns out the height of the Bakiev autocratic regime was one of a global money laundering center, right? Some estimates of $1 trillion passing through. And Tom also exposed the different structures of shell companies before the Panama Papers that were helping to comprise AUB's international transactions. And Bloody Red Carpet on the trail of Maxim Bakiev, the son of this Kyrgyz gentleman. And my personal favorite, Mystery on Baker Street. So if everyone remembers Sherlock Holmes, who lives at 221B Baker Street, well, Tom found out that actually 221B Baker Street is now owned by a shell company traced to a Kazakh oligarch. So with that intro, we're really grateful Tom's flown in all the way from London to share with us some details of the investigations and the work that he's done over the years.
If you're doing the last presentation of the day, you better bring some slides. That's my rule. Thanks, Alex, for that introduction. For 13 years I was at Global Witness, acting as the person mainly responsible for the Central Asian reports. I think Global Witness was one of the first organizations who really noticed that when dictators were stealing their country's natural resource wealth, that it was really being laundered through Western financial institutions. And it was up to me and other people in my team to investigate that and then campaign for the laws to be tightened. So I'm going to take you through today, just briefly, some of the techniques I used to write these reports. I think most of my work was really regarding the tracing of company ownership. Tracing company ownership. And I think the reason we did this was, as Casey was saying about the libel issue, the UK laws are even more stringent than the US laws. My layman's interpretation of it is, and this is, again, I wouldn't take this as gospel, but in the US, basically, the person who feels they've been libeled has to prove that the journalist has maliciously lied. Whereas in the UK, basically, the journalist has got to prove what they're saying is true. So that puts the burden on the journalist, on the writer. There are ways around it. You can be kind of just a little bit more creative with your language. So instead of saying it is money laundering, you say it has appearances of money laundering. It's a red flag for money laundering. But it did mean that we really had to rely as much as we could on documentary evidence. And so this is why we were always trying to find as much company information as we could. So whenever there was a media report about Company A doing a deal with Company B, we'd go out and we'd try and get those company documents from various company registers around the world. I would also agree with Casey in that I would say probably 80 or 90% of the information that we were using was really publicly available, or occasionally you'd need to maybe buy a document from a company registry. But it was out there, and it was just up to us to put it together. We did use sources to give color, to provide direction, to back up what we were saying. But really, we were relying always on documents. Now, you might ask yourself, well, if we've been talking today about how easy it is to hide beneficial ownership, and you're going to bet your bottom dollar that oligarchs are going to be not putting their name on any document. If you're not going to find a name on a document of the particular oligarch, what's the point of doing this? Well, I would say that number one, opacity is itself a red flag, and sometimes it's a good story. For example, this story, which is from Ukraine, Transgas was a gas supply company. It was supplying gas from Russia and elsewhere to Ukraine. It's making hundreds of millions of dollars. It didn't really need to exist because Gazprom owned the gas, it owned the pipelines, and yet there was this private company acting as a middleman that was in charge of delivering the gas. And this is actually a very classic scheme of taking something that really should be state-controlled and moving those revenues to the private sphere. And the company, Transgas, was registered in Hungary. Its first official owner was this elderly actress who said she got involved to pay her phone bill. She was obviously a proxy, but the very fact that she was there shows that the company was trying to at least hide its ownership, if not its activities as well. So we got all the documents that we could. After a while, Transgas, they acquired 3 new shareholders. Louise Lukács moved out, and they got 3 new shareholders. You can see them there, one from Africa, 2 from Europe. And I think what they were trying to say is that we're a legitimate company which has these 3 shareholders. We've got investors now. But what we did is when we got those company documents from around the world, you don't really need to see the detail here, but you've got Transgas at the bottom, you've got the 3 shareholders there. If you trace the structure back, it all led to 2 companies in Cyprus. So even though they were trying to maybe appear like they had a lot of shareholders, or at least 3 shareholders, in actual fact, the fact that it led back to one address in Cyprus really suggested that there was only one person or one group of people behind the company. Because of a little bit of scandal to do with Ural Transgas, the company was replaced by another company, Rosukrenergo. This time, Gazprom had 50% of the shareholding. It received 4 days after it registered a multi-billion-dollar company struck between Russia and Ukraine. This chart here isn't an actual ownership chart, but it shows the links between all the nominees and the proxies and all the offices of Ural Transgas at the top and Rosukrenergo on the bottom. So this showed that really it was basically the same company, just renamed, re-registered in a different country. 50% of ownership was Gazprom, which was new, but it was basically the same people. And lo and behold, he was mentioned earlier by Daria because of one of our reports, in part because of one of our reports. It was revealed by a Gazprom-owned newspaper that Ukrainian oligarch Dmitry Firtash was indeed the owner. I think along with this investigative research into the companies, we'd always try and play devil's advocate as well. So asking, is there any possible reason for this company to exist? And I think that is good not only from a libel point of view, but also kind of strengthens your case if you're seen to be trying to explain the company in other terms. For example, it was said to us that maybe because of the tense relationship between Russia and Ukraine, that you needed a middleman in order to negotiate between the two sides. Maybe it was very hard to extract payment out of Ukraine, so you needed a guy to sort that out. But then the question becomes, why would Gazprom, the biggest, baddest gas company in the world, give up? Is that worth 50%? Literally hundreds of millions of dollars you're giving to one. You're giving up to Firtash and his business associate. So you start to get into the intricacies of the argument, and I think that really boosts your case if you've thought about that. An RUE official from Austria, you could obviously see from that statement, obviously they decided that this 50% was a fair share to give to these partners. I think, to me, that sounds like even he's questioning it. He says, ask Gazprom, this has nothing to do with me. They've decided to give up 50%. So, you're onto something when you get a statement like that. Moving quickly on to another case that Alex mentioned, Kyrgyzstan. In 2010, there was a revolution, and soon after that revolution, it was revealed that a particular bank called Asia Universal Bank, of which Bob Dole was on the board for a time, it was alleged that Asia Universal Bank was actually a money laundering vehicle. We had one bit of non-public information. We had a partial list of some of the companies that held accounts at Asia Universal Bank. So what we did, as we've done in the past, we went away and got all the company registry documents for these companies. They were mainly registered in the UK, in Belize, and New Zealand. And again, the detail isn't really important, but what this shows, all these companies are at the top and the bottom, that they were either registered on the same date or by the same service provider, usually at the same address, and by 3 or 4 service providers which are in the middle. So what does this tell us? This was showing that these weren't companies which had a proper business that was just had a bank account at this particular Kyrgyz bank. These were shell companies whose sole aim was to move money, if not launder it. Dead man owns 700 million company. What does that mean? Well, we found that one company registered in the UK, and not offshore UK, but mainland UK, had actually been the director's name was dead. Someone had used, it was a dead Russian guy, someone had used his identity fraudulently to register a company in the UK. And because no one checks these things, no one would ever know about that if it wasn't for the Kyrgyz revolution and these documents making their way to Global Witness. Some of these companies were registered at 1 Map Street, Belize. These 4, remember that address. Maxim Bakiev was the son of the then president of Kyrgyzstan, and he was alleged to be basically the power behind the throne. But he denied having anything to do with this Asia Universal Bank. He said that he didn't even have an account there. He then moved to the UK, where he claimed asylum, was granted asylum, right or wrongly. Theresa May was Home Secretary at the time, another Another great decision, Theresa. And there was a U.S. extradition case. They tried to extradite Maxim to the United States on insider trading charges, I think it was. That actually failed for reasons we won't go into here. But it did give us Maxim's address in the UK. This is his house, pretty modest, £3.5 million house in Surrey. But when we went to the registry, the land registry of the UK, we see that the company, you might not be able to read it, but it says Limium Partners Limited. Now that company we've not come across before, but it's registered Map Street, Belize City. And if you go to the Belize Company registry and you pull Limium Partners' record, 1 Map Street, registered agent, International Corporate Services. So out of all, he says he had nothing to do with the bank, but out of all the company service providers in the world, of all the places you can get a company from in the world, he just so happens to have used the very same company that has been involved, allegedly, in money laundering in Kyrgyzstan. It's not proof, but I would say it's a pretty interesting coincidence. I'm running out of time here, so I think I'd just end with maybe Alex said to talk a little bit about oligarchs. Now, I don't think I really use the term oligarchs so much in a Global Witness. I don't really think it encapsulates that element of state capture. I think there's a big difference between, say, a classic Russian oligarch like Roman Abramovich, who was basically a nobody, who didn't really have any political ties at the beginning, who gamed the system to make a lot of money. The politics, I think, with those guys came later when they became a threat to Yeltsin and Putin. Seems to me, I think, something quite different between that kind of oligarch and Maxim Bakiev, Gulnara Karimova, who are basically just stealing money from the state. Another example here from Kazakhstan, the bottom is Vladimir Kim. He's the one of the owners of Kazakhmys PLC, which listed in the UK in 2006. It was, it was a big deal. It became part of for a time, the FTSE 100 share index, so our most prestigious British companies. Now, he was, as I say, at the time it listed, you would call him an oligarch because he was one of the main owners of Kazakhmys. But much more interesting from when we're talking about kleptocracy, from my point of view, is the guy at the top, Vladimir Ni, who was basically, he had been described to us as Nazarbayev's butler. He was definitely the chief of staff. He'd worked with Nazarbayev for, how many years is that, 13 years. And then, when he leaves the chief of staff position, he joins Kazakhmys just as a director. Lo and behold, a year later after the company listed, listed in 2005, a year later in 2006, sorry, I've got it wrong there. It says it should be Kim gives Ni. Kim gave Ni 2.5% of the company. Just gave it him, worth 135 million pounds. So this is the guy we should be, really more interested when it comes to kleptocracies. How much of that did Ni cash out and was like a reward for his many years of service in Kazakhstan? Did he give any of it to Nazarbayev? We'll never know, because even in the London Stock Exchange, the threshold for disclosure is 3%. So 2.5%, he might still hold. I mean, Ni's actually dead now because he was quite elderly. His family might still own those shares. He might have sold them up and given the money to who knows. So oligarch isn't really a term you would use for Ni, but just very important when we're looking at this the element of kleptocracy. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now, and I think I ended on this one just because it shows how endemic it is to our society. This was a company that was on the FTSE 100 share index that people in the UK would rely on for their pensions. They would, if you had any investment funds that would track the FTSE 100, you'd be relying on Kazakhmys, as it then was. It's now been renamed Kaz Minerals. And yet no one seemed to be asking any questions at all about the morality of allowing such a company with such close ties to the Kazakh president to list, but also legally, had the company actually complied with all the regulations. We tried to focus on the regulations. For example, one regulation is that you're supposed to give investors the information that they would need to make an informed decision. Nowhere in the Kazakh prospectus was it mentioned that Ni worked for 13 years for the Kazakh president. He was presented as a mining engineer, which is something he did in the 20s, but left. We raised this with the financial authorities that govern the stock exchange, and they basically didn't want to know. So we didn't get anywhere with that. So that's what we're up against. So that's it for now, and I think maybe we're on to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. And that's a striking illustration to what Matthew was talking about, sort of the export of sort of corrupting practices and different sort of standards becoming then sort of reconfigured and used, in this case, by the London Stock Exchange. Okay, so I have some questions, but time is short. We are going to end at 4 sharp, so I want to throw this out to the audience who might have some specific questions on the research side. And yeah, in back here.
My name is Flávio Ferreira. I am an investigative journalist from Brazil. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I'd like to ask you, I think that we have a problem that after the investigations of the DOJ, of other authorities, we journalists, we do not have access for what was produced by investigations. Like I've been covering the corruption scandal called Car Wash Operation, and when we access the documents of the DOJ, the plea bargain, you can have just access to an edited version of the plea bargain. Like you can see the employee 1 did this, the employee 2, and like an American citizen was the beneficial owner. A conspiracy happened in a law firm in somewhere. I would like to ask you, what should be the position of the press and people that work in this field to go against this? Because we most of people here are combating secrecy in shell companies, but what about the secrecy in the public by the public sector, the investigations, and I think that the public opinion has the right to know what was investigated.
Yeah. No, that's great. And Ren, maybe I'll put you on the spot and ask you to respond to that. And particularly, I think, your question raises a really good point that, the DOJ here has such important role to play globally because they become the source and sort of the fact-finding through which a lot of details of these schemes and these cases become revealed back to host countries, whether it's a Brazil or a Kazakhstan or so forth. So I think one of the obviously sort of ongoing investigations, there's going to be walls and privacy and so forth. But I wonder if you've thought about this sort of the public role, right, that these settlements and what goes on that DOJ website and sort of the press release sort of provide both here and to these separate countries where these corrupt acts took place.
It's a good question, and thanks for your work you're doing in Brazil, kind of an important place, right? A little place called Curitiba changed the world a couple of years ago. But remember that, in the context of large foreign bribery cases, very hard to detect, right? Hard to detect, some of the money movements, hard to detect the actual bribery that's involved. Multiple provisions of the FCPA talk about that. We don't need both. But in the DOJ model, we are so big on incentivizing companies to come forward and self-report, self-disclose. They do an audit and there's an issue. There's a whistleblower internally and they want to do an internal investigation and report that. So when they do self-report, because they're given things like 50% off the bottom line of penalties and fines if they fulfill certain criteria after the pilot program's now gone permanent. Those cases would largely go undetected and unenforced and unprosecuted if they were never revealed by the company. That's a reality. These are complex cases. I think most people understand that. In that context, though, often cases when they're negotiating, and it's a big negotiation, right? Depending on what you get, a non-prosecution agreement, a deferred prosecution agreement, a declination with disgorgement, a declination, or in some cases actually go to trial. Imagine that. And so I think in that system, there's some assurances paid that some of that will be kept quiet. And as we know, under the FCPA, we don't charge the foreign official, and so they're never really named. And so what I would say to you is there's a couple options you have. Number one, you always have a FOIA request in the United States, which is a very powerful mechanism where you can get incredible amounts of information as long as it's not classified generally, okay? That's one area. The other area is going back to the network discussion. You know, we just saw some great slides by Tom. Forget the oligarch for a second, forget the kleptocrat. The network is actually far more important. If you can figure out the network, you can actually get to the money and take the thing of power away from them. If you're doing your investigation and you start piecing together, okay, if we've got a complaint, and DOJ does a very good job, by the way, of listing the complaints, the press releases, the indictments were often very detailed and lengthy, right? We talked about one today, 250 pages, pretty detailed. Taking those little bits and pieces, little dots, and then going to open source or pulling complaints that were done in Brazil, or then this was done with the Netherlands. It's a global resolution. What are the other countries? Who else is reporting on that? I would argue that almost 95% of the time you can figure out and unmask every co-conspirator that was unindicted and everybody else that was involved. It just takes a little bit longer. And I don't want your job to be any more difficult than it is. Clearly, we believe in, you know, free press. It's incredibly important to this whole process and this discussion. But I think you can get there pretty closely. You know, that's what I'll say about that. There is a reason some of that's kept back. It's in the negotiation. Some people don't like how that plays out. I get it. But remember, if those companies are not self-reporting, we're missing massive amounts of cases and potentially huge grand corruption schemes that will never get detected or would be basically hidden for a long time.
Yeah, great. And Tom, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I agree with you to some extent, but compared to the rest of the world, the stuff that the DOJ releases is far in excess, I think, of other countries. Like the UK has very little reporting on ongoing investigations, whereas the DOJ has been a wealth of information on a lot of the investigations that I've done. Occasionally, you do get those moments where the Kazakhgate indictments, for example, referred to, I think, Nazarbayev as KO2, but it was clear it was him. And actually, other legal documents that came out in the case later, you could actually cross-check and realize it was him. Or in the case of Gulnara Karimova, I think it referred to her as kind of Uzbek official 1 or something. But it was so clearly her. At one point, it said,
Goes
her boyfriend, and you could Google the boyfriend's name or something like that. So it was really clearly her. And I only wish that I had that kind of information in the UK with some, for example, like the Serious Fraud Office have been investigating the Kazakh company in ENRC. We know that it's been ongoing, but there's just nothing to read about it, and it's all kept underneath the surface.
And there is also a very interesting dynamic, I think, that the Gulnara case brings up, which is the way that investigations and press releases here then set off effects in other parts of the world. Not only in terms of other investigations, right, asset seizures and so forth that we had, cases in France and Netherlands and so forth, but actually prompting the board of Telia to not take, executive leaderships for it and dig further. I mean, there was also this investigative, story by sort of a Swedish documentary company, but it was these multiple sources of pressure that actually took them out of their comfort zone and made them sort of investigate, and eventually led to the CEO's resignation there. Then there was also, in the Uzbek case, a second consequence, which was, again, this is circumstantial, so we can't prove it definitively, but these investigations seriously undermined Gulnara Karimova's power back home, or it seems as if they did. And they soon after these international cases were announced. Then you saw domestic seizures of her assets and properties, sort of indictments of her circle, placed her under sort of house arrest. Now, of course, this was part of this domestic power struggle in Uzbekistan, but certainly I would say the highlighting of this internationally, empowered, the anti-Gulnara faction domestically, kind of thing. So it's important to understand. So what happens here in terms of these investigations really, has important repercussions overseas in a lot of ways that aren't immediately clear. Yeah, please.
Hi, Glenn Cozart-Cheney. I'm with APCO Worldwide. I'd love to talk a little bit more about this ecosystem that you're describing. From the U.S. policy perspective, I've heard that really the government is more limited in the sources that it has available to it, and really the sort of from a financial perspective and from a time perspective to do this work. So I guess maybe, Ren, I would love to hear sort of the differences from the private sector perspective versus your time in government, if your tactics in investigation have changed. And then for Casey and Tom, as we use these pieces and as the work that you do fuels further investigation, whether it fuels, maybe it fuels sanctions, whatever it is, how does your research and the way that you approach your work change in that context, or does using Shaltai Baltai, for example, limit the impact of your work? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let's talk about the resources quickly. I actually felt like at the FBI we had really wonderful resources, very intelligent people on the same page, working in teams. And remember, we had two very important levers, subpoenas and search warrants, which we don't have on the private side, right? And so, and really getting the banking information and subpoena banking information was everything. And having really good forensic accountants. We had some of the very best forensic accountants at the time in the Bureau working on these programs. And so we had more resources than anybody else around the globe, and we were very fortunate. And so we were always very careful when you go to other places and, and ask for things. Remember, we had the long reach of the U.S. jurisdiction with the money systems and the corresponding banking. And so we really could go to other countries and share information, usually MLATs and things like that, with pretty good success. And if we didn't, we could find other ways to pressure, within the U.S. government, and OECD could do peer reviews and things like that. It was a pretty good process. But we had limitations, right? So there are limitations within the U.S. government, of course, and those are in place, and those are important under the Attorney General guidelines, and under the thing called the Constitution, right? Imagine that, right? It's an important document that totally outlines how we operate, and it's a really wonderful document, but has limitations that are purposeful. On the private side, and remember, in the U.S. government, in the FBI perspective, we were looking for cases to prosecute. We're not just collecting intelligence, we're collecting evidence. Mm-hmm. Different than other agencies in the United States who just need to collect data points, right? Everything we do has to show that we're going somewhere with this. We have to certify evidence overseas, bring it to a U.S. court, and actually have to prove that it's actually legitimate. Now let's switch gears for a second. Government to private sector side. A lot of my clients that I'm working with just need to know the information. Do they want to go forward with this merger? Is this acquisition of a foreign company going to be problematic because the company used to be on an OFAC list, right? They just want to know yes or no, is that a relationship we want to go forward with? That's just strictly intelligence. And from a source perspective, getting information on the ground, you can go a lot further out deeper because you don't have some of the limitations that you would have normally on intelligence collection. Now, in some of my clients, they're facing criminal or civil litigation issues, and we do need to certify that evidence and that information can be corroborated because it may end up in front of a U.S. court or some other court around the world. And so it really depends on what you're looking at. But the U.S. is very well positioned, had lots of resources. Of course, we always wanted more, but under the program I was involved in, it was under wonderful growth, and it continues to grow. The Bureau and the Department of Justice, the SEC, continue to grow capabilities, and so I really couldn't complain it was there. The one thing I will add on the private sector side is that we have the ability to launch things like technology much faster. Not that the government doesn't want to find technology solutions It's just they can't move quickly in procurement. They have to make sure that it's tested correctly, it fits into their systems, and it's an open procurement system, of course, and the transparency of that procurement, which is critical. And so it's slower to get there. Whereas on the private sector side, if we find great technology and we know it works and we can prove that, we're going to use that as fast as we can because it means efficiencies and accuracies that are really important.
Yeah, I think it's a great question as it pertains to sourcing. I mean, sourcing is always a concern, no matter the story, no matter the scoop, no matter whatever you're covering. So in this instance, if we talk about Shaltai Boltai, which is Russian for Humpty Dumpty, which is this hacking outfit that we've relied on for prior stories, we and numerous other outlets have relied on for stories. It comes down to bolstering those findings, bolstering that coverage through other interviews, through other pieces of evidence, whether it's other cybersecurity experts, whether it's other domestic political experts, whether it's obviously especially reaching out to the parties involved themselves, either those who are communicating with one another or those who are being talked about. So in one of the instances, this Komov gentleman, if we're writing about his emails with Malafaia, we reach out to both of them. In the past, they've denied. Sometimes they just ignore, and that's fine. That's their prerogative. As it pertains to the Americans that were involved in some of these emails, you reach out to them as well. In this instance, they admitted that they were involved in this gala that was discussed in this email. They denied anything nefarious about it, et cetera, et cetera. But that confirmation lends that much more credence to the story in and of itself. So it's always a concern, and it always requires bolstering beyond simply the material in question, especially for something as ethically difficult as hacked materials.
Yeah, great. Let's do a lightning round and get a final group of questions. Paul?
Sure.
Mike's. Sounds fine.
We're really concerned with attacks on investigators and journalists.
Yeah.
And I mean, in specific, we're thinking of like Jan Kuciak and Daphne Caruana Galizia and so on and so forth. And also just kind of maybe more generally the way oligarchs fight back, libel laws, lawfare, stuff like that. If you could address that at all, that'd be great. Thanks.
Great. Any other question? Matthew, please.
Quick point.
Yeah.
Since you sort of for Tom and Casey, since you brought up the example of Yukunin and the room with the fur coats. This may have been missed earlier, but when I was working for Mr. Scholler over here on doing due diligence for Alstom, who was thinking of doing a joint venture with Russian Rail, the real issue we faced was not who are the beneficial owners, but we were presented with an intermediary of a state-owned enterprise as the bargaining agent, as the commercial arm of Russian Rail, which would do the deal. And so the question I want to it's a problem set for this community, which is, do we know how much of the state sector in Russia is owned not by the state per se, maybe in sort of paper, but owned by intermediary companies that are in turn owned by beneficial owners who happen to be former state officials or current state officials. I think the reason we were stopped in our due diligence process, Bill, is because we probably were going to find out that Yukunin was a beneficial owner of this intermediary company.
Yeah.
So just as a problem set, I'm just curious about where you think we are on that.
It's a great question, and Rick Erickson used to teach Soviet economics here, and so we bring him back every year to teach our MA Pro seminar. Estimates that that's north of 70% now of the Russian economy. That's his latest figure on. Okay, let's go. Final thoughts in responding to these two great questions, and let's start with Tom this time and work our way down.
On the attacks question, I mean, that is a problem in itself, and I know Global Witness, for example, have been tracking attacks and murders of environmental defenders, and maybe something in the future. I mean, I'm not at Global Witness anymore, but maybe somebody or Global Witness could look at further attacks on all kinds of journalists just to track the problem. I think if you are part of an organization, either Global Witness or OCCRP, it gives you maybe a little bit more protection. It is harder if you're the kind of lone wolf out there in particular regions, and yeah, that's hard to know how to deal with. The libel issue is, I think, not one that's going to go away, certainly in the UK, but luckily nothing that I wrote at Global Witness was ever actioned again, so there's a way of phrasing the language sometimes that can get you around that. Yeah, and your question, yeah, I would love to have that data. I know when we did the It's a Gas report, we were certainly looking at how much of this gas is, Ukraine's supply, how much of this would be in total, Ukraine's overall energy and even Europe's energy. But as you've identified, that's just one section. You've got railway, you've got all the different state companies which have their own version of the middleman scheme. And I would love to get that data.
Yeah, and as it pertains to fighting back, Paul, I try to go to the gym regularly, so if I'm ever in a scuffle, I can hammer. But no, I mean, from time to time. But I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm glad that Tom brought it up. I'm incredibly fortunate to work in the American context. I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to enjoy the First Amendment protections, to be able to enjoy things like anti-SLAPP legislation that can be just dismissed out of hand if they come against our work. But it just comes back to, again, in the American context, making sure you cross all your T's, dot all your I's, contact everyone you need to contact. Again, it's an incredible privilege to work as an American journalist for any number of reasons, and to be able to highlight the pressures that other journalists elsewhere, increasingly in the European context, face as well. So unfortunately, I don't have any proposed legislation on that front right now. As it pertains to the state sector, I think north of 70% is as fair an estimate as I've have reason to think. I think an excellent example and something that I've seen other journalists not struggle with, but it's been kind of a consideration and a conversation is, we have this, obviously, these, SDNs, the sanctions regime against any number, I don't know what the final number is, of Russian officials, oligarchs, et cetera, very clear dynamic, very clear, bright line, working with, doing business with, helping out, et cetera. As it pertains to the other, billionaires, billionaire Russian nationals, individuals like Len Blavatnik comes to mind, who have made their money in the post-Soviet, especially in the Russian context, and have now begun to attract extra scrutiny as it pertains to where are they sending their donations? Where are they sending their children? What are they doing with that? Political donations especially. There is increasing interest in, but also increasing conversations around how newsworthy is that, how concerned should we be about potential blowback therein, and how does that fit within the broader context of influence operations, interference, et cetera. So it's a question I don't think will end anytime soon.
Yeah, great. Ren, final word.
Journalism is clearly, I think, under attack more than ever before, not just in the U.S., but globally. It is a critical function of this solution. We need the men and women around the world doing this critical reporting, but, you have to take care of yourself. There's measures to do that. But to your point, we also have the luxury of being in the United States. But now that the news cycle is so fast, it's seconds, it's not minutes, it's not days, we have to do a better job of making sure that when we get information out, it's right. When you do get information, please get it out, get it to the open, and get it where people can get to it, and so people can collaborate on the problems.
That's great. Well, this is a great panel. I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank Ren, Casey, Tom, Daria over Skype for getting us started. I do think this reputation laundering is difficult, but I think maybe it should be the source of a future kind of workshop and so forth. I know the day is late, so I know it says concluding remarks on the schedule. I think we have a lot to think about. I want to thank Matthew for facilitating and leading and really being the driving force behind so much of this great work. Also, I want to thank Tanya, too, for the fantastic panel she put together and her wisdom and support on this. And thanks all of you for being here. So let's use, the 10 minutes that we were supposed to for concluding remarks. Let's re-engage, maybe exchange cards. Let's kind of make an agreement to meet again this time next year, right? And sort of tackle some of these, and who knows what other issues are going to come. But thank you again for sharing your days with us. I've learned a tremendous amount today, and we're excited to keep this network going forward. Thank you again. Right.